In summer of 2020, the state of New York introduced a bill that would have basically outlawed any display of the symbol, and it would have trained children to call 911 if they saw that symbol on display. Think about the impact of such a law on our communities, on our mandirs, on our houses, on somebody traveling in a plane with a swastika banner or with a swastika, a pendant or whatever. There was no nuance to that law because the lawmaker did not know that there was any alternative meaning to this symbol. The Hindu community launched and partnered. That's when we discovered Dr. T.K. Nakagaki and other Buddhist leaders, Jain leaders. We all came together and we launched a very aggressive campaign to educate about the meanings of this symbol. We spoke to lawmakers up and down the aisle in New York and ultimately got that bill stopped. That same process got repeated in the state of Maryland and New Jersey.
Namaste Sangam Talks viewers. Welcome today to a special conversation addressing the misconceptions surrounding the Hindu swastika, particularly in the Western world. Over the years, there has been a confusion with the Nazi symbol, the hooked cross, also known as Hakenkreuz, being erroneously referred to as Hindu swastika. Organizations such as Coalition of Hindu of North America have undertaken a campaign to dispel these misunderstandings and destigmatized the sacred Hindu symbol we call swastika. In the midst of going on global discussions about discrimination, particularly in the context of Israel's involvement in a conflict and the remembrance of Nazi atrocities against Jews, there has been a worrisome trend of associating the swastika again with the Nazi hate symbol. Therefore, efforts to educate people on the true history of Indian swastika and emphasize its distinction from the Nazi hate symbol, I would say, is very important. Without considering the nuances of its cultural and religious significance, people have been brainlessly equating the Hakenkreuz with the swastika. Since its launch in 2020, the campaign has successfully prevented the passage of bills aiming to ban the swastika in the states of New York, New Jersey, and Maryland. In 2022, the coalition achieved a partial victory in California when the state amended a similar bill to include the term Hakenkreuz for the first time, but unfortunately there was still insistence on including the term Nazi swastika. Joining us today is Pushpita ji, a board member of the Coalition of Hindus of North America, and she is going to shed light on the ongoing efforts to clarify the true history of the Indian swastika and to advocate for its accurate understanding, especially in the face of the misinterpretations that we are seeing nowadays. With that, I'll hand over the stage to you.
Namaste, everybody. Thank you, Sangam Talks. It's a pleasure to be here. Very honored to be talking about this very important topic today, which is basically the swastika versus the Hakenkreuz. Hakenkreuz is a word that I hope many of you may not be familiar with, but I hope more and more of you become familiar with it, because understanding the difference between these terms is very critical to correcting a historical wrong. Before we get started, I just want to, because this is a very sensitive topic, we like to make sure that we lay out some things for background, which basically is that this presentation is meant for educational purposes and to create awareness. And as Hindus and people of the Dharmic tradition, we are the first people to stand in solidarity with the Jewish and other communities, acknowledging the horrors of the Holocaust that they face and the anti-Semitic targeting that they continue to face. And we are in this presentation, this campaign is in no way an attempt to deny or downplay the horrors that they faced and continue to face. And in this sense, we absolutely have no common ground and actually work against the same groups that target them, like neo-Nazis and supremacist groups, because their goal is to spread hate and intolerance. And our goal is the opposite. And I think, as was mentioned, The timing is really important because we are now entering a time when many of the survivors of the Holocaust are moving on, and this story is getting more and more baked, and current political events, both the current conflict but also the surge in white supremacy that we saw over the last 5 years, has made this a very sensitive topic, and also a more relevant one where it's really important to get the facts right, because the swastika is a very ancient and auspicious symbol for over 2 billion people in the world. I mean, that's a staggering number, and that's not going to go away. So it's really important that everyone comes to an understanding of what these symbols are, what are the right ways to talk about it, and what this means to different people, and to engage in a respectful conversation so that we can all come to understand each other better and arrive at a better place. Some definitions that are important to remember is obviously the word swastika. When we talk about it in the context of our presentation, we strictly mean the Sanskrit word swastika, astika, which means that which brings good luck, well-being, and it is important to multiple Dharmic traditions, not just Hindus, but Jains, Buddhists, and as my presentation will show, to many other cultures across the world. The term swasti is a very ancient one. It occurs in the Vedas, in many other ancient Hindu scriptures, and it has many meanings, but all of them positive: good luck, prosperity, auspiciousness, good start, luck. And it is revered, as I said, by many different faiths. On the other side, you have what we call the Hakenkreuz, and the Hakenkreuz is a German word which translates to hooked cross. It was a symbol designed specifically by Hitler. He actually writes about how he designed this symbol in the Mein Kampf, and it was used by the Hakenkreuz was used by the Nazis extensively during the years that they were ruling Germany, and it fronted many horrors of the Holocaust, as we've said before. And we fully acknowledge that to the Jewish people and those many other communities, the Roma and the homosexuals and others who were targets of that pogrom, that Hakenkreuz represents genocidal evil, and it continues to represent that evil today because it was responsible for the extermination of over 6 million Jews, 1 million Roma, and other people. It brings fear and trauma in the pain and hearts of these communities even today. But the swastika has been in use for at least 10,000 years. Many Indian viewers are familiar with the swastika and wonder why this even needs any explanation. But when we live in the West, which is where I'm living and where a lot of these laws and definitions and conversations are framed, there is actually widespread ignorance of this term. And when I show some of these images, people are shocked. I showed this to some California lawmakers, and one of them actually said, okay, I'm getting triggered because this, even though you're telling me, I'm actually getting triggered and I don't really understand what's going on. So we try to show that when a symbol, and even within India, there's some confusion because people say, oh, the Nazi one was this facing and ours is the other facing, and ours is red and theirs is black. We show these images to show that, look, when a symbol is used by 1 billion Hindus, it gets used in many different ways. Yes, primarily it faces one way and primarily it's red and many people use dots. But as you can see, right, somebody put a little black swastika made out of kajal on their kid's head. So you can't always say it should be red. This mandir actually has the swastika tilted. Don't go by that, just help understand the differences in the words. And what I discovered just on this trip to India is that there is a little swastika clay tablet from the Indus Valley civilization in the National Museum right here in Delhi. So that's how ancient this symbol is for us, but I won't belabor this point because everybody knows what the swastika is in India. But it's also very common in Southeast Asia, Japan, China, and in Japan, it is known by other terms. It's most famously known as the manji. And you immediately start to see why we talk about context, because you can see the manji actually starts to look a lot more similar to the German Hakenkreuz because it's tilted, it's facing the other way, it's often done in black or green or whatever. But you can see that it's always used in a very, it's on the heart of the Buddha, it's in places that are kind of very similar, good luck, auspiciousness, bringing. But beyond that, this is where I think the story starts to get interesting, because I think what we need to understand is this symbol is a truly global symbol, and a truly historical one, because you find it not just in the Asian cultures that I just described, but you find it in the Native American cultures of of the Americas. And if you look at this little picture that I have on the screen of this little pin cushion with a swastika, or what looks like a swastika embroidered on it, this is actually in the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. And it's a Mohawk pin, it's a pin cushion from the Mohawk tribe from about 150 years ago. And you see a lot of beautiful rugs where this symbol comes over and over again, and a sacred drum where they have this symbol. And the Native American tribes called it the whirling log. Europe actually had a long and ancient tradition of using what looked like this symbol prior to World War II. And, we can go on and on, but like you'll see it on ancient Greek helmets and sculptures from 300 BCE. You see it in the Finland president's flag. You used to see it on different military equipment. You see it in different old carvings, old floors. So it was very common in Europe too, again by different names, different cultures had different names. Africa and the Middle East, you will find a lot of medieval churches where this symbol has been used in the sacred artifacts that they use, in their building, masonry, etc. Iran, you can see in Africa, there was a tribe that used to actually tattoo it onto their backs. Truly global symbol. That's one thing to really remember, because today it's sacred to 2 billion, but through history it has been used by many, many, many more cultures, which maybe it not be so popular today. And Israel and the surrounding areas, the swastika, or the symbol that looks like the swastika, has been found in ancient synagogues. It has been found in ancient churches in Jordan, in the Tower of David, in lots of different places. So something about this symbol has really appealed to human groups all over the world through history. And that is why it is so important to keep that context in mind as we look at what happened in the last 150 years in Europe. And at the turn of the 20th century, there was a resurgence of interest in this symbol, and it became popular in Europe and North America by the word swastika. And you started to see it used a lot in building design and architecture, but also just for fun symbols, like Coca-Cola would issue like little good luck tokens with a swastika on it. The Jewish business handed out good luck tokens with swastika on it. Some fruit company called themselves a swastika. There was a football team that put swastika on this. So it was just seen as a general symbol of good luck, and why not? Great for and even today there are places in US that are named for the swastika that have survived several rounds of name changing. So what happened, right? How did we get from a place where such a beloved and widely used symbol has become now known as a symbol of hate? And that's where we get into the history of the Hakenkreuz, or the hooked cross. So when we look at the Holocaust, right, you can't look at that just in isolation. The Holocaust was the culmination of centuries of vicious anti-Semitism that prevailed in Europe, and that manifested itself in many ways. But if you look at even the Holocaust Museum, they have a very dedicated website where they talk about the long-term issues that led to that explosion of Jewish hate, the otherization of the Jewish community, and the early church unfortunately played a big role in it. I won't belabor that. I would encourage people to look up the website and see it for themselves. But that context is important to understand, because the hate that targeted the Jewish community in the Holocaust had a long history in it. You can see, major figures in Christianity like Martin Luther and different churches played a big role in creating and otherizing the Jewish community. Just look at something like the Merchant of Venice play, the famous play by Shakespeare, and how the character of Shylock is portrayed, right? How his business is portrayed as a vicious, blood-sucking business, how him asking to get repaid is portrayed as something weirdly inhuman. These were all tropes that were used to otherize the Jewish community over centuries, and the church played a big role in it. And we need to keep, and coming back to the hooked cross specifically, the hooked cross is a symbol that was found and continues to be found in medieval and old churches in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Europe. And we are sharing a few of these pictures here, whether you look at cathedrals in England, in Mexico, in Ethiopia. The hooked cross was a very powerful symbol that was used over and over again. So where did Hitler get the idea for the hooked cross or the Hakenkreuz from? So this is more of a speculation, but Hitler grew up in the shadow of the Lammbach Abbey, and on the walls of the Lammbach Abbey is this hooked cross. And this is something that people believe influenced him. And at that time, and as some of our slides show further, German Christians were fully aware of the connections between hooked cross, Hakenkreuz, and the other crosses that were used in Christian iconography, Christian materials, and you can see all of them shown here. And Hitler actually describes in Mein Kampf how he designed that very graphic red on black Hakenkreuz that came to emblemize the Nazi party. But if you look at the excerpt from the Mein Kampf where he talks about it, now you may not know German, I don't too, but you can see very clearly Hitler wrote in German. That was the language he was familiar with. There is no evidence that he knew English or Sanskrit. So he's very clearly writing the word Hakenkreuz. You don't need to know German to see that there's no word swastika in here, but there's multiple references to the word Hakenkreuz. And actually the first translation of Mein Kampf did correctly use the word hooked cross, but unfortunately that one never became popular. And the second translation, which was done by a Catholic priest, James Vincent Murphy, that for some reason translated the Hakenkreuz into the swastika. And that is the translation that then became popular as the World War ended, and that was the start, one of the reasons that this mistranslation became more popular. And again, you have to look at context when you're looking at words and what was prevailing in society at the time. The word Hakenkreuz was not the only word that used the word Kreuz. German literature, German military honors used a bunch of the word Kreuz. There was Christian Kreuz and Ritter Kreuz and Balkan Kreuz and Wilken Kreuz. There was even a military honor that Hitler created called the Ritter Kreuz, and that was given as the largest military honor. It makes sense, right? So if you think about Indian military honors, we say Paramveer Chakra, Shok Chakra, Mahavir Chakra. There is a sequence. You don't just have an odd word dropping in the middle of it all. It would make no sense. It wouldn't motivate the people you're trying to motivate. So anytime you're trying to motivate a population, you will use terms and concepts that they already understand and that they already revere. You won't import a word from halfway across the world in a language that they don't understand and say, oh, this one is going to motivate you, right? So I think people just, if you look at it from a common sense, logical perspective, and you start to see that in this plethora of medals and terminologies and terms, there's no swastika anywhere in Nazi terminology, Nazi materials, Nazi honors. And Nazi literature and Christian church literature at the time used the word Hakenkreuz, and there were actually booklets issued that sort of talked about the complementary role of Nazism and Christianity, of the regular cross with the hooked cross. So there was a lot. And these are the German leaders of the time talking about themselves, not people, historians talking later. And this is not us making up stuff about them. This is literally going to the primary source to see how they talked about themselves. There were lots of books in Germany published at the time that referred to the Hakenkreuz. No books that talked about the swastika. It is just not something that was in their lexicon. And there's a lot of, again, we talked about the historical role of the church in building anti-Semitism, but there is also the role, and more research will happen, I think, in the years to come about the role that the church played or didn't play in stopping the Holocaust as it happened, and there's a lot of historians who are already working on this and who are already sort of trying to see what led to this kind of stuff. But again, there was no Hindu, Buddhist, Jain person out there, motivating the Nazis to do what they did. And I would refer everyone to, there is a wonderful Japanese monk who lives in New York called T.K. Nakagaki. He's written a book about this Hakenkreuz versus swastika difference, calling it Hitler's symbol. And he has speculated, and more research is needed in the area, but he has basically said, who could have benefited from the translation of turning a Hakenkreuz into swastika? And he basically speculates that, maybe there was some interplay going on. Remember, World War II was a fight between two sets of primarily Christian powers. And so probably, and there are actually some American army booklets from that time given to soldiers saying, hey, as you go into the countryside, this is how you distinguish between a cross and a Nazi cross. So there was already some talk happening, but so it may be a little thinking about who benefited really from disassociating the word cruise from the horrors of the Holocaust that were later discussed. And so, more research needed in that place. That's not what we really go into. We want to basically talk about how this corruption of the word happened and why we today need to care about it. So there was a time when the world, even the Western world, called the Hakenkreuz a Hakenkreuz. And before we go into that, one of the folks who actually warned against the corruption of this word is somebody who I know is not very popular in Dharmic circles otherwise. But Max Mueller actually warned against people using the word swastika outside India, because something that led to the popularity of the symbol in Europe was the discovery of this symbol in Grecian digs that were happening at the end of the 19th century. So they discovered the symbol, they saw people in India and various parts of Asia were calling the similar looking symbol swastika, and so many in Europe started using it, which was the designs I had shown earlier, the good luck token, the football team, etc. But as that happened, Max Mueller warned people that saying, really the usage of the word swastika should be limited to the Dharmic faith, because it's a very specific, auspicious meaning related to it, and there can be a lot of potential for mischief if we just start using these terms out of context, which is really what was happening when Coca-Cola was issuing a token with that symbol on it, or a football team was putting it. They were not calling it, they didn't have the Dharmic, Swastika in their mind. They were just like, it looks cool, here's the term, we'll use it, which I think speaks to the danger of cultural appropriation, all that we talk about nowadays, and that was an early example. But there was a time when even the Western media called the Hakenkreuz correctly as the Hakenkreuz. So, the rise of Hitler is well documented, and let's look at what 100 years ago the New York Times was calling his symbol when they were reporting on the rise of it. This article is from 1922, and it quite clearly talks about the rise of Hitler and his followers, who New York Times calls the Hakenkreuzlers, not the swastikers or swastika followers or anything, calls them the Hakenkreuzlers. So this was a term that was well accepted in journalism in those times. You can see the Jewish Daily Bulletin doing the same, talking about documenting the rising atrocities against Jewish people in different parts of Europe, but constantly referring to the symbol as Hakenkreuz, not swastika. And Nazis were avid propagandists themselves. I mean, they published their own literature, they published their own newspapers. Guess what they called their newspapers? Not the swastika banner, but the Hakenkreuz banners. And so I think you have to, you have to take people for their words. And if they are calling their symbol the Hakenkreuz, there really is no reason to be saying, no, they actually meant it to be the swastika. You can see that even as late as 1934, the New York Times was still calling Hitler's symbol as Hakenkreuz. But New York Times, like in many other cases, has played an infamous role in driving this narrative change, because in 1933, for the first time, contradicting their own reporting from earlier years, they started calling Hitler's symbol swastika. And they also came up with this big article about, an old symbol, the hooked cross, making its way from India into Germany. Very illogical kind of argument, because India didn't have a hooked cross. India had a swastika. Hooked cross was in Europe, and hooked cross was right there in Germany. Germany did not need to import hooked crosses from India. It had it right there on its own abbeys and churches. But this was the first time we see New York Times use the word swastika to describe Hitler's symbol, contradicting its own reporting from 1920s. And also, as I showed in the previous thing, right? In 1934, when they reported, they still by mistake used Hakenkreuz, which happens because, if you are in a job and your boss suddenly changes the terminology on you, you'll use it, but sometimes you might lapse into old terminology. And all of these snapshots that I'm showing, these are actually, if you go to our website, CoHNA.org/swastika, you will find a link to a page where we link to New York Times archival articles. So these are not just snapshots that you can accuse us of doctoring or photoshopping. If you have a New York Times subscription, you will actually find those articles still up on New York Times websites. So people can say there's a lot of history, who cares what happened. Today it's called, the swastika, and we hear that in the West a lot. When we explain the history, and they're like, well, fine. But now it's been taken over, too bad, you can't get it back. So to that, we have to say, look, that's not true. We never lost it because Hitler never used the term. So there's no taking back the swastika. Hitler never used it. We never lost the term, and we never stopped using the term. What you guys did was you started using a term that he never did. And really, in terms of historical accuracy, it was the Hakenkreuz that oversaw the horrors of the Holocaust, not the swastika. And oh, by the way, this is not an academic debate because there are continuing costs to this misinterpretation. This cost is obviously most evident in the West. And I'll talk, because we have had to curtail our, how we practice our religion, how we practice our faith. Everybody is familiar with the kar puja that people get done. In the West, some mandirs, the poor priests, they make you open the cover of the bonnet, and they'll put the swastika on the hot engine inside, because if they put it on the car, then there's a danger that your car will get vandalized, and sometimes they'll end up singeing their fingers or something because the engine is still hot. So there's a lot of stuff that we face in our day-to-day lives, but let's start with a global problem that everybody faces, right? Including all the viewers of Sangam Talks who live here in India, who might be wondering, why should I care about all of this? My life in India is fine. I can put swastika all over the place and nobody's coming to get me. Encourage all of you to go to Google. And if you go to the Google Translate and do a German to English translation, and if you type Haken in there, you'll get the word hooked. If you type the word Kreuz, you'll get cross. But if you type the word Hakenkreuz, Google will suddenly spit out the word Nazi swastika. So you can see that even in India, you are being subject to misinformation, despite all the wide knowledge about the sacredness of the swastika, and despite the hundreds of thousands of Indian Hindu engineers who work in Google India and Google USA. So no, you in India are not exempt from this, because what happens online, it goes on to feed AI engines. If you look at AI, they are already giving you flawed answers on what a Hakenkreuz versus swastika is, and the situation will only get worse if not tackled. But let's look at real life impact that this misunderstanding has on people living in the West today. Let's look at the Native Americans. The Native Americans continue to get targeted back in 1840, the tribes had to sign an agreement saying that, we agree to give up our sacred symbol because the Nazis have co-opted. Think about how unfair that is for a group of people who had already been genocided out of existence and, lost their land, lost their religion, lost everything, and then they had to give up their sacred symbol too. And even today, right, if somebody goes to sell an old historical artifact from the Native American tribes, sometimes there'll be a whirling log on it. And then this poor guy who's from a Native American tribe gets targeted as a neo-Nazi. How ironic is that? And how terrible it is that a group that faced such a terrible genocide is even now not allowed to freely use this sacred symbol. Let's look at the Jains. A micro-minority in India, certainly in every Western country that they live in. If you just Google sacred symbols of the Jains, you will find that everywhere in the world, their sacred symbol incorporates the swastika. Except in North America. There, the Jain Association of North America, because they are so tiny and because they are so scared of using this symbol, they actually changed their religious rituals and put a different symbol. I also like to just bring up the example for Indians, right? Every year, hundreds of thousands of Indian students head to US and Western universities to start new exciting, lives as students or start new jobs. You might be carrying a little artifact, a little puja equipment, a little murti that has a swastika on it. You go put it in your room, and your roommate walks in and has no context and gets horrified as to that, he or she has been paired with a neo-Nazi. So you really want to make sure that people in the West understand that this symbol has multiple meanings, multiple names, and they need to look at context to understand what they're looking at. Because already Indians who live in the West face this problem all the time. We have had, on Diwali, you'll do a rangoli, very likely to have a swastika on it, or you put up a little Ganesh entry thing in your entryway, very likely to have swastika on it. So, you have the delivery men who get angry, handymen who walk out because, they're like, hey, I'm not going to be working in the house that is inhabited by a Nazi, because they have no idea that this symbol could have multiple meanings. They have very linear dimensions of it. There was a Jewish student who came to India and understood the context, took a swastika, Hindu swastika, back to his dorm and wanted to use as an educational tool. Instead, the poor guy got hounded and had to apologize and stop that whole process. In the Bay Area in California, where I live, a summer camp which had a swastika that was Japanese in origin and had been installed in the building at the start of the 20th century, meaning a couple of decades before the rise of Hitler. That building had to shut down its summer camp and remove that historical symbol because, the camp counselors just freaked out. They're like, oh my God, this is an unsafe place. We're not going to work here. So the problem is actually getting worse, not better. So for all the people who say wait for time to pass, I always tell them, if you don't tackle a problem now, kicking the can down the road makes it worse and not better. So, this symbol we need education on this symbol just so that people can continue to live lives with full freedom of religion. Now, from a Dharmic perspective, from people who care about India, Indian history and Indian culture, the more you allow this misunderstanding to flourish, the more you open the way for Hinduphobic historians and academicians and media people with an agenda to grind, to create a conflation between Hinduism and Nazism, which, as we have shown, literally did not exist. So you have our very own Audrey Truchke, who was actually talking about swastika in India, and notice the words that she used. So at times, swastika is used in a somewhat ambiguous sense. I'm sorry, but who uses the swastika in a negative way in India? It would actually make no sense, right? Supposing I want to wish death to somebody and I go draw a swastika on their door, the person will say, oh, thank you, you're wishing me good luck, right? So this whole tweet makes no sense, except when you see it as part of a larger trend, which we are now starting to see in the West over the last 5 to 10 years, of starting to very directly associate Hitler with Hinduism and Nazism as inspired by Hindus, which, something we heard during the infamous Dismantling Global Hindutva conference. So I think Indians and Dharmic folks all over the world need to take back and really drive usage of the correct words. Otherwise, Hinduphobic players and Hinduphobic institutions will continue to make false connections between Hinduism and Nazism, as you see here. So you see here the website of a guy who's a white nationalist, Mark Major. He's a published author. He has a following of 100,000 people or more. So this is not a troll. This is a major figure on the white nationalist movement. And a couple of years ago, he was attacking the construction of a Hindu temple in Texas. And what does he do? He doesn't bring up zoning issues or anything else, right? He starts to create hate for that temple by saying, oh, when Hitler and Nazis were looking for ways to get inspired, they didn't look to the church, which we know they did. They went all the way to India to get inspired, and they brought the swastika from there. So this sort of misinformation, these sort of tales will become bigger and bigger unless we, as those who love the swastika, those who use it, those who understand it, take the right steps and cut this terminology whenever we see it, because Hitler used the Hakenkreuz. Hitler was inspired by the hooked cross, not by Hindus and swastikas. And there is expanding scope for more harm, as you see. So there's some people who are deliberately trying to create misinformation like the white nationalists, but then there are Jewish advocacy groups that are now basically associating not even the symbol but just the word swastika, and they are saying, hey, why is there a swastika? And that is what led to a slew of laws, which I'll talk about in a minute. There were actually laws that are being put in place now to ban the use of the word swastika, to ban the display of the symbol, and think about the impact that has on religious freedom. But before we get there, let's finish up the thought, because this comes up over and over again, right? Was Hitler inspired by Indian or Hindu symbols? Did he really use the swastika? Even if he called it the Hakenkreuz, did he use it because he saw it in India? Well, people can speculate what they want, but the evidence is quite contrary. We've shown the widespread usage of the hooked cross where he was growing up, but also Hitler was no fan of India. And there's plenty of speeches where he has made his hate for Indians quite clear. I mean, and that makes sense. Hitler hated the brown races. He was all about the superiority of the white Aryan race. Why would he be wanting to take a symbol that was sacred to a bunch of brown people halfway across the world? In fact, even though he was at war with the British, he thought that it was good, because there's a lot of quotations out about Hitler and what he's thought about Indians, and how he thought that, despite his enmity with the British, it was good that the British were ruling the brown savages of India. What is it that all of us can do about this, right? Change is underway, and we all need to understand and do our bit in growing it. Some of the hard work's already been done. Many people don't know this, but in 2007, there was a very high-level meeting that happened between some of the most senior rabbis in Israel and some of the most senior Hindu spiritual leaders, and it was called the Hindu-Jewish Summit. And at the end of it, the very senior Israeli Jewish spiritual leaders understood the issue, and they said, we understand the swastika has nothing to do with our pain and our terminology. Unfortunately, what happened is there was no work done to build on that proclamation, and so that proclamation sort of soon got forgotten. But a lot of the work at the highest spiritual leader level has been done, and now what do we need to do with it? Well, that's where organizations like CoHNA have been playing a major role in helping take this discussion forward and making sure that people in the places that matter know it. Then we are also very proud to be a founding partner with the Understanding Swastika multi-faith coalition that was created in 2022. Which brought together senior spiritual leaders from the Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, and Native American traditions, basically saying, we are now going to work to take our sacred symbol back, and we ask everyone to use the correct terminology. This is a wonderful alliance. Everybody needs to look them up, and everybody needs to make sure that their spiritual organizations join and further the work being done by this group. But let's take a look at what's been playing out in the real world in the last 2 or 3 years that really made us amplify the swastika and awareness campaign that we have been running. So in summer of 2020, the state of New York introduced a bill that would have basically outlawed any display of the symbol, and it would have trained children to call 911 if they saw that symbol on display. Think about the impact of such a law on our communities, on our mandirs, on our houses, on somebody traveling in a plane with a swastika banner or with a swastika, a pendant or whatever. There was no nuance to that law because the lawmaker did not know that there was any alternative meaning to this symbol. There's a university called Brandeis University, which is a Jewish university, and it had just elected an Indian American student president. And this girl said, let me help you guys understand the context why we are opposing this law. For doing that, she got majorly targeted by Jewish activist groups, but she got support from the rabbi of Brandeis University. Again, so the spiritual leaders have an understanding of what this symbol means to different spiritual groups, and it needs to be taken into the secular realm, which is where folks like us and all the viewers of Sangam Talks have a role to play. And legislative change is already underway. So I talked about the New York law. When that New York law was introduced, the Hindu community launched and partnered. That's when we discovered Dr. T.K. Nakagaki and other Buddhist leaders, Jain leaders. We all came together and we launched a very aggressive campaign to educate about the meanings of this symbol. We spoke to lawmakers up and down the aisle in New York and ultimately got that bill stopped because they realized what they were about to do. Then that same process got repeated in the state of Maryland and New Jersey, which had also introduced bills to ban the swastika. So you can see that when you speak up for yourself and you talk with reason and logic and facts, you can actually make a difference. And we did this without hurting. We were not trying to hurt any of the groups. We understood that the people who were introducing these laws were coming from a good place, because in the 2018 to 2020 era, we had seen a resurgence of white supremacy movements. And very often you will find them using Hitler's symbol and those kinds of crosses, and which are again mistakenly called the swastika. So in an intent to tackle that hate, the lawmakers were just about to ban a symbol that actually impacted the Dharmic faiths, and then they stopped that, which is a way advocacy works. And I think in the years that follows, we've actually been, like I mentioned, stopped bills that would have criminalized in 3 US states. Stopped it in Canada, because in Canada, a private member bill was also introduced that would have done the same thing. And on the flip side, we've actually had good laws pass in some of the states. So in 2022, the state of California similarly introduced a bill that would have outlawed the swastika. Then again, we started the same process of engagement with the lawmaker, with the senators and other legislators in California, and we educated them. Now, California was not a complete victory. It was what I call a half victory. But California did end up passing a law. With the victory part is, for the first time, there was a California law that referenced the word Hakenkreuz and actually distinguished the fact that, this symbol has multiple meanings. The Hakenkreuz is Hitler's symbol and it should be banned. And the display of the swastika by Hindus, Buddhists, and Jains was specifically exempted. So, if you live in California, you put up a swastika for Diwali or, whatever, or a monastery and somebody complains, well, you're actually protected by law. Most of us don't know that, but it's important to know that and know that happens. The problem was the California law still kept the word Nazi swastika, which is an oxymoron, because as the data shows, Nazis never used the term swastika. So we should really never associate the term swastika with Nazis. The swastika is only a purely auspicious, positive term. There is no Nazi swastika, because that implies there's a bad swastika, there's a good swastika, and as the data shows, there's no such case. There's only one good swastika that is used by Dharmic faiths. We lost that battle, but there's always more battles to fight, and it was good to get Hakenkreuz in to the law at least, and to get the law specifically decriminalize the display of swastika by Hindu, Buddhists, and Jains. And Australia, 2 provinces in Australia passed good laws that similarly past the difference between Hakenkreuz and swastika. So I think progress is underway. Like any people's movement, the more people get involved, the more they work, the more they educate, the more they push, the more traction we'll see. The state of Oregon, unfortunately, again, you always win some, you lose some. They changed the name of a place called Swastika, but they also introduced some pretty good teaching materials for their students, which are now starting to teach students at Oregon about this is exactly what we want people to do. We want them to understand the difference between similar looking symbols, their names, and their context, because context really matters. We've been talking with Holocaust survivors and Jewish groups as well, and some are on board and some will take longer to come on board. That's okay. But here's a quote from a Holocaust survivor, an 85-year-old lady whose family perished in a major way as Auschwitz. And she basically said that once she understood the context of the symbol that she thought was the swastika, and understanding that actually that was a different thing, and that the swastika is sacred and beautiful and inspiring to 1 billion people around the world, that helped her in her healing process. And she said it was a way for her to let go of the past and look at the future. And if people look at our website and our YouTube channel, they'll find a lot of talks we've done with Jewish scholars who understand this, who've talked about this from a Jewish perspective. So, it's baby steps, but we're all on a good track, and there's a lot more to go. In terms of engaging with, the question comes up a lot, why don't you engage with the Jewish community, get their buy-in? And I want to just let people know that, yes, we are doing that. And in fact, in if you look at our website, if you look at our YouTube channel, you will find a lot of commentary, a lot of talks, a lot of discussions with rabbis, with Jewish scholars, Jewish professors. In fact, one of our strongest allies in this fight is a young Jewish scholar called Jeff Kelman, who's done his whole master's thesis on this differentiation of how Hitler's symbol is the Hakenkreuz, not the swastika. And so we are finding more and more of these allies. In fact, I'm very happy to share that just this past week, we had a big breakthrough. There is a gentleman called Steve Heller. He is a kind of leading writer, thinker, design intellectual, on this issue. He has authored 2 books on the swastika as Hitler's symbol. And at one point, he used to say that the swastika was an quote unquote irredeemable symbol of evil, to basically understanding that there is a Hakenkreuz, there is a swastika. Hitler never used the term swastika, and the swastika is not a hate symbol in so many different contexts. This is actually a huge transition for somebody like him, who basically had built who had built a career on talking about the irredeemable aspects of what he considered Hitler's symbol, and now understands as a more nuanced position. But I think it should really encourage everybody who's listening and wondering what they should do with this information, because speaking for yourself, making your case, he started on this journey after an interaction with Dr. T.K. Nakagaki, and has come full circle. And this January, he's actually published a very detailed article that I think we can link to and people should read, talking about this issue in a very nuanced, very sensitive, but very detailed and factual manner. And I think everybody can use his article and take it to their schools, to their colleges, to their offices, and really educate on what is going on. And let me explain why education is needed for everybody who thinks this is a theoretical issue. During the COVID times, when everyone was doing Zoom meetings, one Hindu gentleman actually got a call from HR. Somebody in a Zoom meeting had noticed that he had, a banner, a puja, a little thing with a swastika on it, and reported him to HR as having a hate symbol in his background. Of course, he explained to HR, and they were like apologetic, and they said they would use it as a learning opportunity. But this kind of stuff can happen. We all live in a very global world. And so, you could be in an airplane and carrying something that somebody, you really don't want it to be targeted as a hate symbol for carrying a symbol of your faith. And not to mention the fact that it's the right thing to do. We all need to make sure that we have the freedom of religion to worship the way we believe is sacred and right for us, that when our mothers come to visit us, they're not targeted for wearing a little swastika pendant or carrying a murti, which has, these are just basic human rights that I think we all need to care about. To wrap it up, we've talked a lot. What's the takeaway really? What's the gist here? Context matters. Nobody is denying the Holocaust. Nobody is denying that hate symbols are used. But if people understand that the same symbol goes by many different names and is used in many different ways, it'll take them like 30 seconds to figure out what they're looking at. And that's important, right? Because if you know that the symbol has multiple names and meanings, if you see it scrawled on a bathroom in the West, you kind of know that that's not a sacred symbol. That's probably somebody wanting to be hate. But if you see it on the wedding card of an Indian colleague, or if you go to their house or apartment and you find they have put up a beautiful looking swastika on their own door, you'll know that they're not wishing themselves death and destruction. That's like illogical. You'll also know that if I'm wearing a pendant with a swastika, maybe you'll give me the benefit of doubt, just like we give people the benefit of doubt when we see somebody wearing a cross, right? Because remember, the cross has also been used in many different ways. The cross is used even today by the hate groups like the KKK. The burning cross is their symbol. White supremacists use various types of cross in their materials, but we don't ban the entire cross, right? We don't look at a cross on a church and start freaking out. We don't freak out when we see somebody wearing a cross pendant, right? We give them the benefit of doubt. And that's all people need to do for the swastika. If you see a swastika, pause, take a look at who's wearing it, who's using it, how are they using it, and you'll figure it out. So education is really key, but speaking up for yourself is really key, because the more Hindus, the more Buddhists, the more Jains speak up for themselves, speak up for their right to use their symbols, the more we will create a better world, not only for ourselves, but also for our neighbors who don't understand. My favorite example for why people should care is, think about an American who doesn't know about the context living in California. California is home to 40% of America's Buddhists. There's a lot of beautiful Buddhist monasteries there up in the hills and stuff. Now, think about it. You're caught in a storm. Your car breaks down. You go to it would look like a building for help. It's a monastery. It's got the swastika or the manji on its gates. And instead of asking for help because it's a sacred place of spirituality and sanction and shelter, you freak out thinking you have arrived at a neo-Nazi den, and instead of getting help for yourself, you run off. So they're practical, they are philosophical and human rights reasons to drive this understanding, but they're also very practical reasons to drive this understanding. And that's what I would ask everybody to think about. In summary, for the Dharmic communities and for anybody who just cares about facts and truth, let's understand that words and context really matter. Let's be disciplined about using words. Everything is not a substitute for everything. So let's use the right words and let's use them correctly. Let's make sure that people don't forget that Hitler never used the word swastika, and so there is no need to take it back. We never lost it. Those who revere the Hakenkreuz can work to take the Hakenkreuz back, but we just need to make sure that the accurate term that Hitler used that fronted the horrors of the Holocaust is what is used. Will it take time? Yes, it'll take a lot of time. It'll probably take a couple of generations. But if you start today, it'll take a couple of generations. If you don't start today, you're just kicking the can down and it'll take 3 generations. So just like people can distinguish between a sacred cross and a burning cross, they can distinguish between a swastika and a Hakenkreuz. So let's all work together to make this happen. Thank you very much.